Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at something I think we've all experienced at one time or another,
Oh, okay.
which is getting advice from strangers that you didn't ask for.
Yeah, unsolicited
Yeah,
advice.
exactly. Unsolicited advice. And the source material we're going to be looking at for this deep dive is a podcast script that's just chock full of all these funny and bizarre and sometimes surprisingly insightful examples of this phenomenon. And one story in particular that stood out to me involves a stranger recommending an alpaca for emotional support.
An alpaca. Wow.
Wow.
That's a new one. But it does raise a fascinating question, though.
Huh.
Why do people offer advice like that in the first place?
Right, like is it a lack of self-awareness? A genuine desire to be helpful? But a complete failure to kind of read social cues?
Yeah.
Or maybe it's something else entirely.
It could be a combination of factors, I would say. Some people might genuinely believe they have these valuable insights that they have to share, even if they're a little unconventional.
So they see themselves as like helpful gurus spreading wisdom to the masses.
Exactly. They may not realize how their advice comes across to a complete stranger.
Yeah.
And then there's also like this social pressure aspect. Some people feel obligated to offer advice, especially like in awkward situations.
Right, yeah.
You know, as a way to fill the silence or just appear helpful.
It's kind of like that old saying, say something even if it's wrong.
Yeah,
But in this case, it's offer some advice even if it's about getting an alpaca.
precisely. And let's not forget about the ego factor, too.
Right.
You know, giving advice, even when nobody asks, can be a way to kind of boost your own sense of importance. It's like, hey, I've got it all figured out, and I'm here to share my wisdom with you, lucky stranger.
So like a healthy dose of ego mixed with maybe some good intentions and a dash of social awkwardness.
That sounds about right. But, you know, regardless of the motivation, I think what's really interesting is how we, as the recipients of this unsolicited advice, respond to it.
We laugh it off.
Yeah.
We roll our eyes, we politely nod, and then immediately forget about it.
Exactly. But, you know, this podcast script that we're diving into,
Yeah.
it suggests that maybe, just maybe, there's something valuable in these unexpected encounters.
Okay.
Even the most outlandish advice,
Yeah.
it might have a kernel of truth or a new perspective that we wouldn't have considered otherwise.
So maybe the alpaca whisperer was onto something.
Perhaps. But even if the advice itself is nonsense,
Yeah.
I think the encounter can still be valuable. You know, it can force us to step outside of our usual thought patterns
Right.
and consider things from a different angle. It's like a mental exercise.
So unsolicited advice as a brain workout.
Yep, you got it.
I like it.
Think of it like a mental stretch. You know, you might not use those muscles every day,
Yeah.
but it's good to keep them flexible.
Now that's a perspective I can get behind. But the source material also acknowledges that not all unsolicited advice is created equal.
Right.
Sometimes it crosses the line from amusing or just plain weird or even offensive.
Absolutely. It's important to remember that not all advice is well-intentioned or even relevant to our lives, and we have the right to just politely decline or completely ignore any advice that doesn't resonate with us.
So how do we navigate this tricky terrain? How do we tell the difference between the nuggets of wisdom and just useless or even harmful advice?
I think that's where critical thinking comes in.
Okay.
We need to evaluate the source of the advice,
Right.
the context in which it's given, and most importantly, trust our own intuition.
That makes sense. Like if you're at the grocery store and a random stranger is telling you to invest all your savings in cryptocurrency, maybe take that with a grain of salt.
Exactly. We need to be discerning consumers of advice, whether it's from our friends, family, or complete strangers.
But this podcast script also highlights some instances where a stranger's advice actually did have a positive impact on the recipient.
That's right. It mentions one person who now lives by this motto, always eat dessert first, thanks to a random encounter at a grocery store.
So even a seemingly flippant remark can have like a lasting effect.
Absolutely. It challenges conventional wisdom and encourages us to prioritize joy and spontaneity.
But what makes some advice stick when other advice just bounces off?
That's a question that has puzzled psychologists and social scientists
Yeah.
for years, and there's no easy answer, but there are a few factors that seem to play a role.
Okay, give me the deep dive breakdown.
All right, well, for starters, the credibility of the source matters.
Okay.
If the advice comes from someone that we perceive as knowledgeable or trustworthy,
Right.
we're more likely to take it seriously.
So a Nobel Prize-winning physicist giving career advice might hold more weight than a random guy on the bus.
Most likely. But it's not just about credentials, though.
Okay.
The way that advice is delivered also matters.
Uh-huh.
If it's presented with empathy and understanding rather than judgment or condescension, we're more likely to be receptive to it.
So tone and delivery are key.
Absolutely. Think about it. If someone approaches you with genuine concern and offers advice in a gentle, non-judgmental way, you're much more likely to be open to hearing what they have to say,
Right.
even if you don't ultimately agree with them.
It's the difference between feeling lectured and feeling supported.
Exactly. And let's not forget about the power of timing, too.
Right.
Sometimes we're just more receptive to advice, especially if we're going through a tough time in our lives and we're actively seeking guidance.
Like, if you're lost in a new city and a friendly local offers you directions,
Right.
you're probably going to be more open to their advice than if you were confidently strolling through your own neighborhood.
Precisely. Context matters. And sometimes a stranger's advice, however unconventional, can arrive at just the right moment and provide a fresh perspective that we desperately need.
So while we might initially kind of scoff at unsolicited advice, it's worth remembering that it can offer unexpected value.
It's like a lottery ticket.
Yeah.
Most of the time you won't win anything, but every now and then you might just hit the jackpot.
I like that analogy.
Yeah.
So should we all just be more open to advice from strangers?
I wouldn't go that far, but I do think it's worth being open to the possibility that even the most unexpected encounter could offer a bit of wisdom or a fresh perspective that could enrich our lives.
Okay, that's fair. But let's not forget about the flip side of this. What about those times when unsolicited advice is just plain bad?
Right.
Or worse, harmful?
That's a crucial point.
Yeah.
And this podcast script we're looking at,
Yeah.
it doesn't shy away from those examples.
Like the person who was told they would be more successful if they just wore brighter colors.
Yeah, that's a perfect example of unsolicited advice crossing the line into superficial judgment.
Yeah, it's reducing someone's potential down to their wardrobe choices.
Exactly. And that's where it's so important to remember that we have the power to choose which advice we embrace and which we reject. We don't have to blindly accept every suggestion that comes our way, especially if it feels off or doesn't align with our values.
So discernment is key. But that kind of brings up another question. If we're not supposed to just take all advice at face value, why are we so quick to offer it in the first place?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's one that we will continue to explore as we continue our deep dive. It seems like we have a paradox here.
Yeah.
We're skeptical of unsolicited advice, yet we readily offer it to others.
Right. It's like we're all armchair quarterbacks convinced we have the winning play, even though we've never set foot on the field.
Yeah.
But why are we so eager to give advice to strangers?
Well, you touched on some reasons earlier. Good intentions, the desire to be helpful, maybe even a bit of ego. But I think if we dig a little deeper, we might uncover some interesting psychological and sociological factors at play.
Okay, I'm ready to dive deeper. Give me the psychological lowdown.
One theory is that giving advice, even unsolicited, can be a way of asserting control in a world that often feels chaotic and unpredictable.
Okay.
By giving advice, we create a sense of order, at least in our own minds.
So it's like a coping mechanism for dealing with uncertainty. Like if I can solve your problem, then maybe I can feel a bit more in control of my own life.
Exactly. It's a way of imposing our own framework on a situation, even if that framework doesn't quite fit.
But wouldn't that make us less receptive to advice from others? If we're so focused on our own solutions, how can we be open to hearing different perspectives?
That's a great point. And it really highlights the tension that exists between giving and receiving advice. On one hand, we crave control and certainty, but on the other hand, we need external input to navigate the complexities of life.
So it's this delicate balance between asserting our own expertise and acknowledging our limitations.
Exactly. And finding that balance can be tricky, especially with unsolicited advice. We really need to be mindful of why we're offering advice in the first place and make sure that we're not just projecting our own experiences and biases onto others.
It's like that saying, don't judge someone else's journey until you've walked a mile in their shoes. But in this case, it's more like, don't offer advice on someone else's journey unless you've at least glanced at the map.
That's a great analogy. It brings up another important point. Unsolicited advice often lacks context. The person offering the advice may have good intentions, but they don't have the full picture. They don't understand your situation, your values, or your goals, so their advice, however well-meaning, might be completely off base.
Like telling someone to quit their job and travel the world when they have a family to support and a mortgage to pay.
Exactly. It's classic projecting your own desires and values onto someone else's life.
But even if the advice itself is misguided, isn't there still some value in the interaction?
Absolutely. As we talked about earlier, even bad advice can serve as a mental exercise.
Right.
It can encourage us to reflect on our own choices and consider new perspectives.
It's like a mirror reflecting back our own assumptions and biases, even if the reflection is distorted.
Exactly. And sometimes that distortion can be illuminating. It can highlight blind spots in our thinking and challenge us to step outside of our comfort zones.
So even bad advice can be good for us.
In a way, yes. It can be a catalyst for personal growth and self-awareness.
Okay, I'm starting to see the potential upside of unsolicited advice, even the cringeworthy kind. But let's switch gears for a moment and talk about the advice giver.
Okay.
What did they get out of this exchange?
That's a good question. And it leads us back to some of those psychological and sociological factors we discussed earlier. For some people, giving advice is a way of affirming their own knowledge and expertise.
It's like saying, hey, I've been there and done that, and here's the secret to success.
Exactly. And that can be a powerful motivator, especially for those who are feeling insecure or uncertain in other areas of their lives.
So it's a way of boosting their self-esteem.
In a way, yes. It's a way of feeling valuable and competent even if their advice isn't particularly helpful or well received.
But isn't there a risk that it could backfire? Like, what if their advice is met with resistance or even ridicule?
That's definitely a possibility, and it just highlights how important it is to be sensitive and tactful when you're giving advice.
Yeah.
Especially when it's unsolicited.
So reading the room is crucial.
Absolutely.
Wow.
If someone is clearly not interested in your advice, the best thing to do is just back off and respect their boundaries.
Okay, that makes sense. But sometimes we just can't resist offering our 2 cents, even if it isn't wanted.
That's true. And there's a certain amount of social pressure to give advice, especially in situations where someone is looking for guidance or expressing frustration. We feel this urge to step in and offer a solution, even when we haven't been asked.
It's like we're hardwired to fix things, even if it ain't broken.
Exactly. And that urge to fix things can be amplified by social norms.
Okay.
We're often told that offering advice is a way of showing that we care.
So it's a way of showing we care, even if the advice is more about us than the person we're trying to help.
That's a very insightful observation.
Yeah.
And it highlights how important it is to really be mindful of our motivation.
Yeah.
And make sure our advice is truly aligned with the other person's needs and values.
So how do we strike that balance? How can we offer advice that is actually helpful and supportive rather than intrusive and ego-driven?
That's a question that deserves careful consideration and one that we'll continue to explore as we keep going with this deep dive.
Okay, so we've talked about why people give unsolicited advice and why we receive it, but let's get practical.
Okay.
If you're getting advice from a stranger, how do you handle that gracefully?
Well, it's a delicate situation, right?
Yeah.
You don't want to be rude,
Right.
but you also don't want to have to sit through a lecture on something you didn't even ask about.
Especially if the advice is getting a little questionable.
Exactly.
Yeah.
One approach is to just acknowledge the advice politely. Something like, thanks for sharing, or I'll keep that in mind.
Right.
That way you're not necessarily agreeing with them, but you are acknowledging their attempt to be helpful.
It's like deflecting a conversational ninja star.
Precisely. And if the advice is way out there or just something you don't, you can always use humor to lighten the mood. A simple, well, that's one way to look at it, or I'll add that to my list of options, can often de-escalate things without being offensive.
Humor, the universal language of thanks but no thanks.
Exactly.
But what if they just won't let it go? Like they've decided you're their new project.
Then you might have to be a little more assertive, politely but firmly explain that you appreciate their input, but you're not really looking for advice right now.
Okay.
And you could even try changing the subject.
Subtle conversational redirection. I like it.
Exactly. It's all about setting boundaries but not ending the conversation completely. But remember, you always have the right to walk away if you're uncomfortable or if the conversation is inappropriate.
Right. A polite, excuse me, and exit stage left.
Exactly. Sometimes the best thing to do is just remove yourself from the situation.
Okay, so we've covered how to deal with unwanted advice, but what about when we're the ones giving it?
Yes, the urge to share our wisdom. We've all been there.
So how do we handle that urge responsibly?
The key is to be mindful of your intentions and the situation. Ask yourself, is this advice really helpful and relevant to this person, Or am I just pushing my own views on them?
So a little introspection before you go into advice mode.
Exactly. And even if you think your advice could be helpful, it's super important to be sensitive and humble. Don't act like you have all the answers.
No.
Instead, phrase it as a suggestion. Just another way to think about things.
Less, here's what you should do, and more, have you thought about this?
Exactly. You're offering guidance, not dictating their life. And remember, sometimes the best advice is no advice at all.
Yeah.
Sometimes people just need someone to listen to them or a shoulder to cry on.
So knowing when to stay quiet is as important as knowing when to speak up.
Absolutely. It's all about understanding the other person's needs and responding in the right way.
Well, this has been have you ever gotten a piece of advice from a stranger that really stuck with you?
Yeah, what made it memorable? Was it the timing the way it was said or the advice itself? Did it change your life or give you a new outlook or maybe just make you laugh?
We'd love to hear your stories. And hey, maybe by sharing our experiences, we can learn a little more from those unexpected encounters life throws our way.
Until next time, stay curious and remember, sometimes the most profound insights come from the most unexpected places.